Yeah, I joined the Marine Corps out of college. United States Marine Corps, commissioned in 1984 as a intelligence officer. I specialized in combat intelligence. The reason why I became an intelligence officer, of course, was the Cold War was very active at that time. I was a Russian history major. I was the child of a career military officer, and I grew up overseas in Turkey and in West Germany, the front lines of the Cold War, and I was very familiar with the threat posed by the Soviet Union to the West. And indeed, one of the reasons why I joined the military was I firmly believed that there was going to be a conflict between the United States, NATO, and the Soviet Union, and if there was, I needed to be on the front line to defend my country and our allies from the threat posed by the Soviet Union. Um, I spent over 2.5 years training to kill Russians, and I'm not joking about that. We spent over 250 days a year in the field training with live fire ammunition under the most realistic conditions possible to close with and destroy the Russian enemy through firepower and maneuver. And I was ready to do that. And then, fortunately for me and the world, in December of 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, um, eliminating two categories of nuclear weapons in Europe that were pushing Europe, NATO, and the Soviet Union to the brink of war. I mean, I don't think people realize how close we were to war in the 1980s. There's echoes of that today, which we'll talk about. But because of my Russian background, I was tasked with becoming one of the first weapons inspectors sent to the Soviet Union to implement this treaty. So I went from training to kill Russians to cooperating with them to make the world a safer place. We got rid of intermediate and short range nuclear missiles. We made Europeans, for the first time in decades, able to go to bed at night not worrying about the imminent demise of their civilization through inadvertent nuclear war. So we were on friendly relations with the Soviet Union, on friendly relations with Russians. I lived next to a missile factory for 2 years, working with Soviet citizens, with Russians, cooperating on the disarmament of these nuclear weapons. And it was a glorious thing. And then when that, in the military, all jobs end and you move on to the next job. And I went on to get my captain's level professional education, but that was interrupted by Saddam Hussein invading Iraq. And I spent the fall of 1990 preparing for conflict with Iraq, and I deployed to the Middle East. And during the Gulf War, I was served on the staff of General Norman Schwarzkopf. I was given the counter Scud portfolio, Scud being Scud missiles. And my job was to try and find ways to interdict these missiles before they could be launched against both Israel and the Gulf Arab states. Needless to say, I and everybody else failed. The Iraqis proved to be very resolute in their efforts, but the war ended. We won. I had what they call a good war, meaning I didn't get killed, and I came out with a good professional reputation. But by the time the war ended, I was confronted with a couple things. One, the Cold War was over. That which I thought I was going to do, kill Russians, no longer applied. And I had just fought my war. I had served my country, and I felt that maybe it's time to get out of the military and move on with civilian life and see what that could offer me. But as Michael Corleone says in The Godfather, every time I try to get out, they drag me back in. And my phone rang in August of 1991. It was a colonel I worked with in the Soviet Union, and he was now the chief of staff of a United Nations organization called the United Nations Special Commission in Iraq, which was formed in the aftermath of the Gulf War to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction capability, including the Scud missiles that I hunted. And because of my arms control experience, my intelligence experience, my experience with the Scuds, I was asked to come to the United Nations and form an intelligence capability that would enable the inspectors to uncover the lies and deceit and the concealment that Iraq was using to hide significant aspects of its weapons programs from the inspectors. Long story short, I did that job for 7 years, and very difficult job under very trying circumstances. I participated in over 40 missions inside Iraq. I led 14 of them as a chief inspector, and by the time I resigned in protest in 1998, we could account for 95% of Iraq's WMD capability. But the problem was the Security Council said that the standard was 100%. So we weren't allowed to finish our job until we could find that last 5%, which meant digging deeper, harder, working more strenuously in a confrontational manner. And the United States decided that that was inconvenient. That rather than seeking the disarmament of Iraq, they wanted the perception of Iraqi non-compliance to be continued so that they could continue economic sanctions as part of their overall program of regime change, getting rid of Saddam Hussein. My job as an inspector wasn't to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but to get rid of Saddam Hussein's weapons. So I resigned in 1998. And since that time, I've been very critical of foreign policy decisions when I view them to be, not supportive of the ideals, values, and standards of the United States. Unfortunately, you recorded me in my home environment, so we get all of the wonderful sound effects that include 3 dogs barking at the neighbors when they walk by with their own animals, and there's nothing I can do to stop this. But I resigned, and I've been speaking out against bad policy ever since. I love my country. I think America is a nation of great potential. I think we have the finest document in modern civilized history in the form of the Constitution. But I think that the values and ideals that are enshrined in that document are imperfectly implemented, and I think that the role we play around the world often contravenes what we stand for as a people here at home. So I think a lot of people get confused. They say, well, you're very critical of your country. I'm critical of my country because I love my country. And I understand what my country stands for, and I want my country to be the country that it can be, not the country that it is. I think I need to touch on 3 things before we get to the actual war. One is NATO. What is NATO? NATO, of course, is a defensive alliance, ostensibly defensive alliance, whose origins date back to the end of the Second World War. And the fear among many in Europe that they needed some sort of collective security structure to hold back any potential westward expansion of the Soviet Union. This is purely fictional. The Soviets weren't planning on expanding west. Anybody who studies World War II will understand that the Soviet Union was exhausted by that conflict. Even though they were victorious, they were in no mood to continue a conflict west. They were more interested in consolidating their gains and ensuring that never again would they be threatened by a European power such as Germany, who would invade them again. So that was their focus. But Winston Churchill, of course, gave a very brilliant speech in Fulton, Missouri, I think in 1946, maybe 48. The Iron Curtain speech, and his rhetoric is wonderful. I mean, even though his the substance is fictional, the rhetoric is wonderful, and Americans, like everybody else, love a good speaker with a British accent, and we fell for it, and Europe fell for it too. They took what was supposed to be this small collective defense alliance between the Benelux nations, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, maybe Great Britain was involved, and they expanded it into NATO to bring the United States in. As Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, famously said, what NATO was designed to keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. And we forget about that third part, and I'll talk about that in a minute because it's very controversial today to speak about that. To keep the Germans down. Never forget that NATO was formed only less than a decade after Nazi Germany was defeated. And when Nazi Germany was defeated, the world was struggling what to do with the Germans. Would we allow them to become an industrial nation? Would we allow them to unify? Would we allow them to exist? I mean, Germany lost the right to have a vote on that. They had endorsed the most odious ideology that the world has seen in modern times, especially, say, the Western world has seen in modern times. Nazi, National Socialism, as defined by Adolf Hitler and implemented by his henchmen. It's mind-boggling that people forget about this. But no, we created NATO, and then a few years later, we allowed Germany to enter NATO. So this defeated Nazi state, which had never been thoroughly denazified, was now militarized, and their industry was brought to bear back into the business of making weapons. Now, ostensibly in defense of Europe. NATO was a defensive alliance. And pretty much you can say that NATO lived up to its vision during the Cold War, defensive alliance. And it was very effective. I have to tell you, I lived in Germany in the 1970s and 1980s, and I saw firsthand the reality of NATO's frontline posturing. In the German villages where we lived, twice a year, the American tanks came rolling out in the farmer's field as they practiced for war. And we're talking about war on a scale that Europeans today can't imagine, even those in Ukraine. Millions of people ready to fight with the most modern weaponry possible, including nuclear weapons. Fortunately, the Cold War ended and we didn't have to have a conflict. But the question now is, what was NATO's purpose when the Soviet Union collapsed? What was the purpose of NATO? Especially given the fact that assurance has been given to Mikhail Gorbachev by the United States and other NATO members that if Germany was allowed to reunify after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, that there would be no movement, not only into Germany, but by extension, east into any other nations that might leave the Soviet orbit. That's in keeping with the defensive alliance. But it became clear that Europe has an identity problem. And what I mean by that is, for the decades of the Cold War, Europe was completely and utterly under the umbrella of the United States defense capabilities. Yes, Britain had a nice military, the British Army on the Rhine, very professional. The Germans had their own wonderful military. The French had their military. The Dutch had their military. Everybody had their military. None of it worked without the United States. None of it worked without the United States. So now the question is, now that the Soviet threat is gone, what does Europe do? And Europe had a problem. Almost immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed, you had the Warsaw Pact. You had the Warsaw Pact collapse. You had Eastern Europe open up with great unknowns. What's going to happen? You saw potential for unrest in Romania, where Nicholas Ceausescu and his wife were gunned down in a back yard. Yugoslavia was destructing in front of your eyes with horrible civil conflict. And NATO was the only unified military structure available to Europe to deal with this. So NATO's mission changed.